Hello and welcome to my channel. If you've been here before, welcome back. My name is Alfonso Peluso and I'm a Studio Associate Professor in the College of Architecture at IIT in Chicago, the home of Mies van der Rohe, the mecca of modern architecture. Also, I'm teaching at Columbia College in Chicago, and I want to give a shout out to both my students at IIT and Columbia College. I hope you're doing well today. I hope everybody who's watching this is doing well today. I'm doing great. The sun is shining in Chicago. The weather's starting to break. It might feel like spring soon. We'll see. Today's video is going to look at V-Ray for Rhino. And there are a lot of videos that look at V-Ray and using V-Ray in Rhino. I think what's going to set my videos apart is that I'm going to look at a strategy of using Rhino and V-Ray together, and we're going to go over a lot of things in Rhino as well as V-Ray. I see a lot of videos out there just really looking at the V-Ray settings, but it's important that you look at both of those together. Okay, so let's look at our outline. So know your model. In this series of V-Ray videos, it's super important to have a good grasp of your model. How much geometry do you have? What geometry might cause issues? So for example, you want to start rendering very early on with just a little of geometry. So when you add that super complex piece of furniture and it crashes Rhino, you know what it is. So we'll be talking about knowing your model over this series. The user interface, light mode, this is brand new. V-Ray Next for Rhino just released an update 2 that just came out yesterday. So we're going to look at being able to change our user interface to light mode. We're going to look at the difference between the interactive renderer and the production renderer. We're going to look at setting up a sun, exposure values, sky background, setting up a camera and naming the view. Timestamp, this is something that I recently found where you can see how long a rendering has taken. We're going to look at some material basics and then we'll close it out talking about resolution. Alright, before we get into the tutorial, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please go ahead and click on subscribe. Click on the bell and get all the notifications. My current goal is to get to 6,000 subscribers, almost at 5,500, so we're pretty close there. A lot of good tutorials on here, something for everybody. Also connect with me on Instagram at my first name Alfonso _ my last name Peluso. Looking to get to 2,000 followers. Lots of good stuff here. See what I'm up to with my students at IIT and Columbia College. Okay, so V-Ray. What is V-Ray? Well, V-Ray is made by a company called Chaos Group, and V-Ray is a plugin. So it's a rendering engine that you can plug into pretty much any software that you're making 3D models in. You can plug it in, as you see here, 3ds Max, SketchUp, Maya. Click on View All Products. You have it all there. Pretty much anything that you're making models in, you can plug V-Ray into. So this series of video is going to focus on V-Ray Next for Rhino, and you see the V-Ray Next for Rhino update 2 just came out. Now, if you click on Gallery, you can see the type of images that people are creating with V-Ray. And I'll tell you, these images are really beautiful. They are really amazing. So this gives you a sense of the type of quality of image that you can create with V-Ray. All right, let's jump into it. Okay, so here we are, blank file in Rhino. We're going to build some model geometry. We're going to build a wall, a ceiling, and a couple walls. A wall, a ceiling, a floor, and let's get into it. So file new, and we're going to go to large objects inches, And I'm just going to work in the perspective view, and I'm going to go ahead and set up my grid so that it's helpful for me when I'm making this model. So we're going to model a space 20 feet by 20 feet. So I'm going to type in DOC, and I'm going to go to grid, and I'm going to change my grid line count to 20 grid lines, one for each foot. So my minor grid lines are going to be 12 inches. Minor grid lines every foot. Major, my heavy grid line, I want to see that every 10 minor, so every 10 feet. And I'm going to set my snap spacing to 12 inches or 1 foot. Okay, so here's our grid that we're going to work in. So in this upper quadrant here, this is 20 by 20. Here's our origin, 0, 0, 0. Okay, so let's go to the layers. Let's make layer 1. I'm going to go ahead and just make that floor, make that current, and we're just going to use some boxes today to make this basic model. So I am making sure that my grid snap is on at the bottom of my screen. Gumball, that's something I'll use later on. So I have grid snap and gumball both turned on. Right now my O snap is disabled for the moment. Okay, I'm going to type in the command box. My grid snap is on. I'm snapping to the origin. So this upper corner is going to be 20 feet, comma 20 feet. So I'm going to type that in, 20 feet, comma 20 feet. And then the height of that box is going to be -6 inches. Okay, so let me hit my enter after my 20 feet, comma 20 feet. And now it's going to be -6 inches for that height. Okay, so there's my floor. Now I'm going to make a couple walls. So I'm going to change this layer to wall. And I'm going to start again another box. Okay, and I'm going to snap to the origin. And then this corner of the box, I want this to be 6 inches in the X and 20 feet in the Y. So that's going to be 6 inch, comma 20 feet. And then the height of this, I want it to be 10 feet. Okay, there's that box. Now I'm going to take this box and I'm going to copy it to the other side. So I'm going to turn on my O snap and select it, type in copy, and go ahead and copy that over. Okay. Alright, so there we go. We got the floor, we got the 2 walls, and I'm going to go ahead and make a ceiling. So know your geometry. We're creating all of this from scratch, so we know exactly what we're making. Alright, so I'm going to type in the command box, and I'll pick this other corner and this other corner, and we're going to extrude it up 6 inches. Okay. Alright, so now I want to spend a little time putting some punched openings in this wall, putting some windows into it. So I have that object selected. I'm going to type in the command invert, inverts my selection to everything else, and then I'm going to type in hide. Okay, so I want to look at this wall from the left side here. So if I go to my right viewport, I'm going to change that to left. So I'm going to go to this pull down, go to set view, and change it to left. Alright, so now I'm going to put in on my wall layer, make sure my wall layer is current, I'm going to put in some openings. Okay, I'm going to do this with a box, and I'll make it about that big. Looks good. Okay, so now it wants the height of the box. So the wall is 6 inches. I'm going to make this thicker than the wall so that I know when I do my Boolean difference it'll create a hole in it. So I'm going to make this 12 inches. Okay, so if I take a look at this in perspective, you see that box there. I'm going to move it into the middle of the wall. I'm going to do that in a top view. Okay, so as long as my midpoint snaps are on, I'm good. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to move it from this midpoint. Now I want to move it to the midpoint of that wall, but I don't want it to lift up like it's doing right now. So little trick in Rhino, if I'm moving this to the right, that's the direction I want to move it to. What I need to do is just press the tab key. That's going to hold that direction, but it's still going to project the snap to the middle of this wall. Hopefully I get that set up correctly. Let's try it again. Alright, so I'm going to take that, we're going to move it from this midpoint, press my tab key to the midpoint of that wall. Alright, let's see what's giving me trouble here. There we go. Alright. Alright, now let's take a look at that in perspective. Alright, so that's looking good. Now I'm going to go back to my left view and just make a copy of this. Alright, so this got moved. Alright. Alright, so we'll go ahead and make a copy. Just going to make 3 of these. Alright, so magically that looks pretty well spaced out there. Alright, so now what I'm trying to do, if I change this view to shaded, is I want to put these window openings in. So I'm going to type in the command Boolean difference. Object I want to subtract from is the wall. Objects I want to subtract with are the boxes. Now delete input is set to no. I'm not going to need these, so I'm going to set delete input to yes. Okay, so there we go. That's going to allow us to let some light into the room from the side. I'm going to type in show and show all the other geometry. Okay, so this is good enough. We can start with this. I'm going to save this. Okay. Alright, so we're going to start working in V-Ray, and you know, depending on how fast or slow your computer is, I'm not on a super fast machine right now. I'm on a older MacBook Pro laptop, so you know, something I want to be conscious of is you know, I don't want to crash my computer basically. So one of the things that can help in working with V-Ray and working on renderings is if I change my view to wireframe, it definitely takes less it takes a load off of the computer processor, so it helps out. So I'm keeping that at wireframe, and let's look at V-Ray. So now the first thing that you need to do in V-Ray is you need to make sure that the current render engine is set to V-Ray. Now I've been working on the computer, so when I go down to V-Ray and current render, it's going to say V-Ray for Rhino because I've been using V-Ray. That's not always the case, so you want to check that. So you again, main menu, render, current render, set it to V-Ray for Rhino. Okay, so once you have that set, you can bring up the V-Ray window. So there's this nice little icon here with the V. You can click on that, and that's going to open the V-Ray window. Okay, so this is what it looks like by default. So I mentioned today that with this new next update, we could change the interface basically from dark mode to light mode, and I'm not sure which one I like better. You get used to one, and then maybe you want to change. So I'm going to click on the settings button. So this little gear button. I'm going to click on settings, and now one thing to know in this V-Ray window is you have options to the left and you have options to the right. So you just keep that in mind. So in this case, I'm using the options to the right, and then I'm going to go down to configuration, and I'm going to change this UI user interface color theme from dark to bright. Alright, so we're going to go with that for now. Alright, so I just want to look at, you know, what does this rendering look like just as is, all we did was create some geometry in Rhino. Let's see what it looks like. Now, in my outline there, we were talking, or I listed interactive renderer and production renderer and the difference between those. So I'm just clicking on this pull down menu for the teapot. So the teapot by itself without the hand, that's what I call the production renderer. When you're making your final renderings, you use the production render. When you are making some tweaks and you want to see the render update in real time, you're going to use V-Ray Interactive. And then there's options to render on Chaos Group's cloud. That's a paid subscription where you can render in the cloud. And then you can also export your V-Ray scene file. And this is for moving all the data from one V-Ray scene to another, or if you want to move from V-Ray Rhino to, say, V-Ray Revit, you could use the export V-Ray scene file. Okay, let's start with the very simple teapot with the hand, which is the interactive rendering. And let's see what happens there. Okay, so now I'm using Rhino 6. Rhino 6 default materials are a white material. So I'm just getting white material applied to all of these objects. Now let's work a little bit with the interactive renderer. Now it's open. The interactive renderer is active, and it's active until I press the stop button. Okay, so when you see the red, when you see this red filled rectangle here, that means the rendering is still rendering. So while I have it open, I can start to look at the sun and how the sun is going to affect this rendering. So in Rhino, I'm going to type in the command sun. And as I start to do things like turn it on and move it around, you're going to see that update in real time in this interactive rendering. So I'm going to click on on. Alright, so now we've got some sun coming here and it's starting to get really bright. I'm going to click on manual control. And what manual control is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to move the position of this sun around. So it was in the front, but now it's moving to the back there. And I can also change its height, how far it comes into the space, and how little it comes into the space. So you see when I'm moving this around in interactive mode, I can see exactly where that sun is, but when I let it finish rendering, it's going to be too bright. Now you see it's too bright. So what we have to change now is something called the environment. Okay, so where do we find the environment? So here in the V-Ray window, we're under settings. This V-Ray frame buffer is still active, so it's still, working on the computer. My fan on my computer is going. I can hear the processor, ramping up and down. So if I go to camera, underneath camera is exposure value. The default is 10. So the higher the exposure value, the darker the scene. The lower the exposure value, the lighter the scene. So as I slide this to the left, it's getting darker. So you see that getting darker as I slide to the left, as I slide it to the right. And I'm not going super fast with this slider, or else it's hard to see it update. Okay, so I'm going to just set it somewhere where not too dark and not too light. And we're going to have to make some tweaks to that environment a little bit later, or exposure I should say. Okay, so we've covered that. All right, now let's look at the background. The background at the moment, or environment map, looks like a gradient, black to white gradient, and I want to go ahead and set that to a sky background. Okay, so in the V-Ray window there is this button here with the checkerboard pattern. If I click on that, you'll see there's a default environment texture, and I'm going to go ahead and click on that. So by default, that is just using this bitmap. I want to change that bitmap to a sky color. Okay, so we've changed that to the sky, and you see that that affects the exposure quite a bit. So you're always going back and forth and tweaking that exposure. So I'm going to go back to settings, and my exposure, I'm going to drag that to the left and make it darker. Okay, so you might be saying to yourself, well, where's the sky? I don't see the sky. Well, that's because we're looking down at the ground plane. We're not looking at the sky. So if I was to orbit in my Rhino window, I'm going to start to see that sky show up. Okay, so I think at this point it's best to look at making a camera so we can get inside the space, look at the sky and make some changes to the sky's color, the ground height. So we'll take a look at that. So now it's important, and I forget this quite often, it's important to stop the interactive rendering. So there's a little stop button here we can click on. Well, let's watch what happens up there when we click on the stop. Okay, so now it's no longer active, and you could also stop it by clicking on that button when it's active. Okay. Alright, so let's close this out. Let's close the V-Ray window. I'm constantly Control S or Command S, depending on what computer system you're on. Although V-Ray is only for Windows at the moment, so Control S. I mentioned that you're like, well, he's running a Mac. He's on a MacBook Pro. How is he running V-Ray? Well, I'm running Boot Camp and I'm running Windows on my MacBook Pro. Okay, so let's look at making a camera. And for me, the easiest way in Rhino to make a camera is start in a perspective view. So I'm in a perspective view, and I don't need to try to make this the camera view. I can just start anywhere in the perspective view. And what I want to do is I want to turn on the camera for this view. So my perspective view is current, it's maximized. I'm using the F6 key. So the F6 key will toggle between showing or hiding the camera. Now, you might say, well, I don't see the camera, and that's good. If you don't see it in the perspective view, you're doing something right. It's when you go to the other views, okay, because the perspective view is the camera. The perspective view is the camera, so you're not going to see it. You're looking through the camera in the perspective view. Now you see your camera in the other views. So you can start to, now I have the gumball on at the bottom. I'm going to turn off grid snap and O snap. I don't want to snap to anything when I'm moving the camera. So gumball, you can use the X axis to drag, you can use the Y axis, or you can use this little XY grid, and you can start to move this camera around, and you see that's updating in real time in the perspective view. Okay, so there's a camera object and then there's a target object. Okay, camera and target object. And the one you want to stay away from is you want to stay away from this one in the middle here, because you see that rotates the camera. Now if you do that by accident, you can always go to View and Undo View Change. And I need to be, when I undo view change, here's something really important, because you saw nothing happened. It stayed rotated. What's important when I do the undo view change is I need to be in the perspective view. I don't need to maximize it, but I need to be in the perspective view when I do that. Okay. Alright. So let's do that again. We'll go to View, Undo View Change. Okay, and that does that. And you saw that there's the home and the end key on your keyboard. Those are shortcuts to do undo view changes. So it's not the edit undo, it's the view. Alright. Okay, so let's keep going with this. So I'm going to move this camera in to the space. Also, I need to be moving it in plan as well, because I just want to stand in that space. And in terms of the height, okay, so we have these I have these grid lines that are every 1 foot. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 feet. So I like to keep my camera angle lower than eye level, so around 4'6". And for right now, I want to keep both the target and the camera about the same height. Okay, now in this perspective view, we don't see a whole lot. Not a whole lot is showing up there. That's because our lens length, if we see the lens length in the top view and you look at this cone, yeah, we're only seeing some emptiness here and then a little bit of that wall. We're clipping right about there, seeing that wall. We're seeing that in the perspective view. So what we need to do is make our perspective view current. We don't need to maximize it. I don't know why it keeps maximizing, but it needs to be current, and then we're going to go to our properties, and from our properties panel we're going to see a lens length. So again, just make sure you're in the perspective view. It shows that here. It's also active right there. We're going to change the lens length. So the lower the lens length, the wider the angle of the camera is. So you're going to see that in the top view when I go ahead and I lower that lens length. Okay, making sure my perspective view is current. When I lower the lens length, okay, so I'm going to lower it to 20. So 20, enter. And now I can see in this space, and I'll change this to shaded. Okay, so now we can see in the space. Now 20 is really wide. You can see that here, and that's the widest I would go because it starts to get distorted. Okay, so let's change this lower. So if I change this to, let's say I change it to 10, now it's unrealistic. The proportions of that room are unrealistic because the angle is so wide. Alright, so 20, and if I change it to 30, it's going to zoom in closer. Now we're not moving the camera, we're just changing the camera's lens length or making the angle less wide. If I change it to 40, and so forth, I'm moving forward. Okay, so let's change it back to 20. Okay, now I want to see a little bit more. I want to see more than just the one window. So going back, and I'm going to move my camera. I'm not going to cheat. I'm going to stay in the room. I'm not going to move outside of it. So I'm going to stay in the room. No reason I couldn't cheat, but I'm going to select that target. Now here, this is where I need to be careful. Which one is the top and which one is the bottom? The top one is not the one I want. So it looks like I'm watching it in the lower left in that front view. It's toggling back and forth. Looks like in this case it's the top one. And then I'm going to move that over. Alright, so now I'm at least seeing the two windows. Now, when I'm making renderings, I like to see at least the two walls if possible in a space like this. So I'm seeing those two walls, I'm seeing the ceiling, and I'm seeing the floor. So that's a good camera view. Okay, so we've set this camera up. Now we want to save this view, the camera view that we've made. So the way that we do this is I'm making my perspective view current, and I'm going to type in the command named view, and I'm going to go ahead and save it. I'll call this cam view, cam short for camera, cam view 01, and I'll click OK. Okay, so that's there. Alright, so now the benefit of saving that view is if now in my camera view I orbit, because I'm used to doing that, and say I orbit that camera view around, now I've lost my camera, but I didn't lose it because I've saved it. So now if I go to my pull down and I go down to set view, named view, I can choose cam 1. I can do it that way. The other way I can do it is I can type in the shortcut named view, and I can just double click on the little icon and it resets my view. Okay, I'm going to set this lower view, I'm going to set this to perspective, so I have a perspective view to work in. Okay, my construction plane is using the front view because this must have been a front view just now before I changed it to perspective. So I'm going to change my C plane back to world. So CP enter, W enter, T enter. Alright, and I also want to turn off the camera because I'm not going to move it around. So I have to make my cam view current, and I have to use the F6 key to turn it back off. Alright, I'm going to change this back to wireframe. So we're going to do some renderings. Alright, so we looked at camera, we looked at name view. Now we're going to take a look back at this sky. So let's go ahead and bring the V-Ray window back up. Okay, so in the V-Ray window, we've looked at settings, we've looked at the teapot with the hand, which is the interactive rendering, and we looked at the other options inside of that. The icon to the right of that, it looks to me like a wall oven. That is the V-Ray frame buffer. So that will bring up your last rendering. So if you close that, it's always going to bring up the last rendering. Okay, so let's start an interactive rendering. We see our camera view is current, so we know it's going to render that view out. So I'll go ahead and click on that. Okay, so now we're in this interactive rendering. And what I want to do now is I want to change the horizon line. At the moment, I don't have a site model, I don't have a plaza or any site elements. It's just this space floating in air. So I need to, I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to bring that horizon down. So if I go to my environment setting here, and I'm making sure sky is the current one. Okay, we have some settings over here for the sky. Alright, as I scroll down here, and I plan in some future videos to look more at some of these settings, but for right now, I just want to look at the horizon offset. So as I move the slider to the right, it's lowering the horizon. And it ends at 10, and we'll see this with some settings in V-Ray where the slider is set by default between 0 and 10, but I want a higher value. And in some cases I can type in 20, and now my now my slider has more of a range. Okay, so there's the offset, the horizon offset. There's also something called the albedo color, and this is the ground albedo. And this color will change this gray area at the bottom, and it will affect the rendering. We'll see that if I change this to a red color, now my rendering is picking up that ground color, because that ground color is bleeding, and through the process of global illumination, it's picking up that ground color. So adjusting that ground color, I mean, you want to be careful with it just because it's adding color into the space, which is something you could use to your advantage. You can start to control it. If I want a cooler type rendering, I can make that color cooler. I'm desaturating it right now, and you see it's increasing my exposure. It's making this scene a lot brighter. Okay, I'm going to darken that up a bit. Okay. Alright, so I'll close that. Alright, I just want to, while I'm here in this interactive mode, I want to position my sun so that these window lights are coming in a little bit further. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and close this. My interactive rendering is still going. I'm going to type in sun, and I'm going to move the position of that sun. Okay, maybe come into the space a little bit more. Alright. Okay. So I'll leave it at that. Alright, I will close the sun. Okay, let's get a handle on what we've covered. So I'm going to stop the interactive render, close that. Now, the screen I had up in the beginning with my outline, I was using my grasshopper window. Okay, so we've covered know your model, user interface, light mode, interactive render versus production render. Looked at the sun settings, we've looked at exposure. We have looked at the sky background, setting up the camera, and looking at named views. Okay, before we jump into some material basics and resolution, this timestamp I mentioned, this is something I recently found that lets me see how long a rendering takes, which is super helpful. In most cases, it seems like they take a lot longer than they actually do, so seeing the time is useful. Okay. Alright, so how do we do that? So if I go back to the V-Ray window and I click on the little oven, which opens up this V-Ray buffer, there are some down arrows in the far lower right hand corner. And if I click on those, this first button here is something called Apply Stamp, and the button just to the right of it is Insert Variables. And when I click on that Insert Variables, let's see if I can make this a little wider. Okay, let me widen out some of these. So these are just a couple default timestamps. A timestamp is something you can put on the actual image, and one of them is what version of V-Ray you're using, and the other is a rendering time. The last, it doesn't give you how long to finish the rendering, but it tells you how long the last rendering took. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click Copy to Stamp, and I'm going to close that. Okay, so that shows up here, percentage render time, and when I click on the Apply Stamp, it puts it on the rendering. Okay, the rendering didn't take 3 minutes 40 seconds, but we were in the interactive mode for that long. Okay, this is going to become more helpful when we go to a production rendering. Okay, while I'm here, how do I get rid of that render time? Well, I can click on that Apply Stamp, and when it's black like this, I can erase what's there. Okay, and I can either put it back the way that we saw how to put it back by double clicking on this or clicking on Copy to Stamp, or I could type it in. So I think it was the percent render time. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right, so before we jump into materials, now this is fairly low resolution, 800 pixels by 450 pixels. Fairly low resolution, but I can go even lower resolution if I'm just doing some quick renderings and I want those renderings to go really fast. When I need to render out some high level of detail, then I can start to raise the resolution. So you want to be working at these small resolutions. If 800 by 450 is working well for you, it's fast, that's great. Let's look at lowering that resolution to make it even quicker, save us some time. So let's go to Settings, and this time let's look at Render Output. Okay, so default render output is 800 by 450. So, and we're using a widescreen for right now. So I'm going to go ahead and change that down to 400. Okay, so now let's do some production renderings. Okay, so we have the timestamp here. Let's go back to 800, because let's look at how long a production rendering takes at the 800 by 450. Okay, so 6.4 seconds. Alright, so you see that the production rendering is much more clear than the interactive rendering. You don't want to use interactive renderings and save them. There's a lot of noise in that. So this is the production rendering. That's 6.4 seconds at 800 by 450. So if I cut that in half and I go ahead and render it. Alright, so 3 seconds. Now, I can also use the wheel on my mouse when I'm in this V-Ray frame buffer. If I click on it, yeah, once I clicked on it, I was able to zoom. So if I zoom at 200%, I'm seeing something about the same size as my 800 by 200 or 800 by 400 image, and it's rendering in half the time. With this image we're looking at right now, it's not that big of a deal because there's no geometry in it. But once you start to get furniture and lighting and all these things, rendering at the lower resolution for your preview renderings is going to help you quite a bit. Okay, so let's get into some material settings. Alright, so we're going to go over to our materials. I'm clicking on that sphere with the checkerboard, and I like to start with a generic material and build my way up from there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on generic. Okay, so it puts a generic material in the material editor. I'm going to double click on it to rename it. I'm going to call this one walls. So I'm going to make a dark gray wall color to apply to my two walls. Okay, so I've set that to walls. I'm going to right click and choose apply to layer. V-Ray sees my layers. I'm going to choose wall. Okay, so I'm going to start my interactive rendering. Okay, so now you're seeing that color applied. So what that means is the default color of a generic material is gray. So what I'm changing right now, and this is just a color, I'm not applying a texture. What I'm changing is something called a diffuse color. So if I lower that color down, it becomes darker, and if I raise it up, it becomes brighter. Now, before this texture was applied, when this was really light, it was really hard on this right wall to see the difference between the ceiling and the wall, and that's something we'll get into in another video, something called ambient occlusion, where I want to see the shadow that is created where two surfaces meet, where the ceiling and the wall meets. But in this case, we're using a darker color, and using different materials when you're making a rendering, different color materials will help you show the difference between surfaces. Okay, and you see this is starting to affect the overall exposure because now we have a darker material in the scene. Okay, we're going to keep it there. Alright, so let's make another material. We'll make another material for the floor, and we'll look at giving that floor some reflectivity. So clicking on that sphere for the materials, and we're going to right click on it and choose generic and double click on it to rename it. I'm going to call this one floor. Okay, I'm going to right click and assign it. First I got to get out of that. Okay, so I hit the enter key to get out of renaming it. I'm going to right click and choose apply to layer and choose floor. Okay, so now you see that dark gray material has been applied. So I'm going to change that. So eventually in the future video I'm going to change this to a wood texture map, but for now I'm going to look at just making it a brown color. And I'm going to desaturate that. You see that when you make renderings, colors very quickly become highly saturated. So we do a lot of desaturating. This is new in the V-Ray next update. It has some families of colors. So with this being new, I haven't really experimented too much with it. Okay, now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add some reflection or reflectivity to this material. So I'm going to close that. Alright, so now we've we're keeping this V-Ray frame buffer low. It's at this 400 pixels, so it's not really taxing the computer's processor. Things are moving nice and fast. Our display mode is set to wireframe. Okay. All right, so here we have the reflection. I'm going to click on that down arrow, and we have two things. We have the glossiness, which was actually set to 1 by default. So these values, these are between 0 and 1. So if I want something matte, a matte finish, I want that to be at 0. This is a place where I can't increase this. It's 0 to 1. That's it. And then the reflection color will actually, you'll see it change here. And then also in the viewport, we're getting now a reflection from the walls and a little bit of the sky. Now, something to note about reflective materials is you really need light. You need a lot of light on the objects to see the reflectivity. And right now this is in shadow until we put some interior lights in here. We have a lot of shadow, so the reflections don't read as well. They read better when the object has some light on it. Okay, so there's a little bit of materials there, material basics. So I'm going to stop this render. Okay, so now what I want to look at is I'm ready right now to make a test rendering at a higher resolution. How do I go about setting that? How do I increase the resolution on that? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to settings here in V-Ray, and I'm going to make the image size higher, the pixel count. I'm not going to go super high right now. I'm keeping the widescreen image aspect ratio. I'm going to type in 1280, 1280 pixels. Okay, so not quite high def yet. And I'm going to look at rendering that out, and let's look at how long that's going to take. All right, so I'm changing this. So I'm going to do a final render. So I'm going to change this from the interactive render to the production render. And it's just going to start rendering that out. Okay, now as this is rendering, something to talk about is we're getting some what we'll call noise or dots or speckles on the image. So we're going to want to look at denoising that. Okay, so that was pretty quick. That was 18.6 seconds. Alright, so let's look at the final bit here, which is getting rid of that noise. Okay, so I can close this frame buffer. Here we see the denoiser. So there's some settings here, but for today we're just going to look at turning that on. Okay, it has a strength where you can increase it, and it has a radius where you can change that, but for right now this is set to default. There's other options there. There's mild, default, strong, and custom. Okay, so those are your options, and this gets applied to the image after it renders. So you have to keep in mind you won't see it while it's rendering. It's still going to look noisy, but it's going to assign it when the rendering is complete. So let's bring back our frame buffer. So hopefully we'll be able to see some of that. I've seen some low quality noise there. So I'll go ahead and render it. So that one took 18.6 seconds. This shouldn't add any rendering time. Okay, there's the denoising. Okay, yeah, definitely smooth that noise out. So it got rid of that noise. Alright, so now when you're saving this image, okay, when you're saving, now you have to be careful with this. I've seen students accidentally change these channels, so you have to be careful with your channel settings there. I think one of these is like a monochromatic mode, so it was a black and white, so you have to be careful with these. Okay, so the default is that RGB is set. All those are set, red, green, and blue. Okay, so I'm going to save this. Alright, now if I save it as a PNG, which I believe is the default, when I open that in my editing software, say I'm going to open that in Photoshop, I'm not going to see the background. The background is going to be gone. And that can be helpful when you're putting a new background in. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. So this is V-Ray. I'm going to say no background. That's the PNG. And I'm going to also, let's say I want to have the background. Now you don't have to save both of these. It just depends on what you want. Say I want that sky background to be in there. I'm going to just save that as a JPEG. And I'll call this V-Ray with background. And I can get rid of the PNG there. Okay, I'm going to save both of those. Now if I go ahead and open up Photoshop, go ahead and close this V-Ray window. Over in Photoshop, if I go ahead and open, okay, so here's the no background and here is the with background. Okay, so you see those. There's no background because that's the PNG, and then there's the JPEG with the background. Alright, so hopefully you found this video helpful. If so, give me a thumbs up below. Leave some comments of what you're looking to learn in V-Ray for Rhino. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to connecting with you on Instagram. Alright, have a great day, and I'll see you at the next video.